I'm Rachel Miller, and what started with a letter in my mailbox ended with me in handcuffs. Not kidding. One tiny detail, something most people wouldn't even notice, set off a chain of events that nearly cost me everything. My house, my freedom, my sanity, and behind it all, a smiling neighbor with a clipboard and a plan. I thought I knew what HOA rules were for, until I found out what they're really capable of. Ever had something small turn your whole life sideways? Feel free to share where you're watching from in a comment. 3 months after buying my dream house in Pine Valley, California, I found an official envelope from the HOA in my mailbox. As an architect who designed this home myself, I assumed it was some routine community notice. I mean, what else could it be, right? Instead, it was a violation notice claiming my lawn was non-compliant with community standards. The paper felt heavy in my hands, official and intimidating, with its letterhead and formal language that screamed bureaucratic authority. I reached for my measuring tape like a surgeon prepping for emergency surgery, because in this neighborhood, every blade of grass felt like a liability waiting to destroy everything I'd worked for. 3.2 inches. The HOA rule stated 3 inches maximum. We're literally talking about 0.2 inches thinner than a pencil, smaller than the margin of error on most measuring devices. It wasn't just absurd, it felt surgical, like someone had been waiting for this moment, tape in hand, measuring hope out of my front lawn with the precision of a predator. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting, but this felt like more than just neighborhood nitpicking from the start. I stood there in my front yard, looking at this perfectly normal lawn that I'd been maintaining just like everyone else's, wondering how anyone could consider this a violation worth writing up. The grass looked healthy green, well maintained by any reasonable standard, yet somehow it had triggered this bureaucratic nightmare that made me question everything about my new neighborhood and the people who supposedly governed it with fairness and community spirit. Meet Mildred Finch, age 52, our HOA president for 8 years. She lived alone with 3 cats in the largest house on the block, always impeccably dressed, always watching from her front window with those sharp blue eyes that seemed to catalog every minor detail of neighborhood life. Her house was pristine, not a blade of grass out of place, not a single leaf on her walkway, everything measured and controlled to an almost obsessive degree. I called the HO, office immediately thinking this had to be some mistake, maybe a clerical error or a mix-up with addresses. When Mildred answered, her voice cut through the phone like ice. "Rules are rules, Miss Miller. You violated Section 7.3 of our community guidelines." I could hear the satisfaction in her voice, like she'd been waiting for this moment. When I explained it was barely over the limit, and I could trim it right now, she said, "Then you'll receive your formal citation within 48 hours. Consider this your introduction to community compliance." Click. She hung up on me. I stood there holding the phone, feeling like I'd been slapped. This isn't how neighbors treat each other, is it? I mean, we're talking about neighbors here, people who should be looking out for each other, not hunting for reasons to cause problems. I trimmed the grass immediately, measuring it down to exactly 2.9 inches, making sure every section was perfectly uniform. Problem solved, right? Looking back, I should have known nothing about this situation was going to be simple. 2 days later, another letter arrived, thicker than the first one, with even more official-looking seals and stamps. Not an acknowledgement that I'd fixed the issue, but a $200 fine for the initial violation, plus an additional $200 fine for disrupting community aesthetics during non-approved hours. Because I cut my grass at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday evening. I'm staring at $400 in fines for grass that was barely too long and is now perfectly trimmed according to their own specifications. The fine notice included photographs of my lawn taken from multiple angles like crime scene evidence, with arrows pointing to areas that allegedly violated community standards. While I'm standing in my yard remeasuring everything for the 3rd time and questioning my own sanity, my elderly neighbor Walter Green approached from next door. He's around 70, has lived here for 3 decades, built like a retired construction worker, but with gentle eyes, and he looked genuinely worried as he walked over. "Rachel, honey, you need to see this," he said, quietly glancing around to make sure no one was watching, before discreetly handing me a folded paper. "Mildred sent this email to the HOA board 3 days ago before you even got your first violation notice." I unfolded it and read, "New resident Rachel Miller shows early signs of non-compliance. Recommend escalated monitoring protocols for Phase 2 target properties. Begin violation documentation immediately. Phase 2 target properties. My blood ran cold as the implications hit me. This wasn't about lawn maintenance at all. I looked up at my house, the home I spent years saving for, the design I perfected in my head for months, the place where I planned to build my life. And suddenly it felt different, like I was seeing it through predatory eyes instead of my own. The evening sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured neighborhood, and I noticed for the first time how every other house seemed to have minor imperfections that nobody ever got violation notices for. Dandelions in driveways, slightly overgrown hedges, mailboxes that weren't perfectly aligned. But somehow, my grass that was barely measurably too long had triggered this bureaucratic nightmare. I thought I was dealing with a grass-obsessed neighbor who took HOA rules too seriously. And what if the grass was just a disguise for something much, much uglier? That evening, Walter invited me over after dark, checking his windows and drawing the curtains before letting me in, like we were planning some kind of covert operation. His living room looked like a detective's office. Boxes of documents, photographs, and printed emails covering every surface, organized with the precision of someone who had been working on this investigation for years. Rachel Mildred has systematically forced 5 families out of this neighborhood in the past 3 years, he said, spreading photographs across his coffee table with the care of someone handling evidence in a murder case. Every single case follows the exact same pattern down to the specific violations and escalation timeline. The photos showed normal-looking houses with families, kids playing in yards, elderly couples tending gardens, young professionals like myself who probably thought they'd found their dream neighborhood where they could build their lives in peace. Then after photos of the same houses with for sale signs and moving trucks looking abandoned and defeated. She starts with minor violations that seem reasonable, escalates the fines using technicalities nobody understands, makes daily life unbearable. With constant harassment, then forces them to sell to avoid bankruptcy. Walter explained, his voice heavy with the weight of watching this happen repeatedly. I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid, but seeing those photos made my stomach drop. These weren't random departures or people who decided to move for normal reasons. This was systematic targeting, and now I understood I was next in line. Phase 2. That made my house sound less like a home and more like a battlefield target on some secret HOA war map. Walter pulled out real estate records that made everything infinitely worse, spreading them across the table like puzzle pieces that formed a horrifying picture of systematic fraud. Every house that vanished under HOA pressure landed in the lap of one company, Titan Holdings LLC. A buyer with perfect timing and apparently perfect inside knowledge of exactly when families would be desperate enough to sell at any price. Houses worth $800,000 on the current market had sold for $400,000 to $500,000. Sometimes even less, when families were desperate to escape the harassment and protect their credit from complete destruction. Every single one followed the same pattern, to families driven to financial exhaustion by mounting fines, forced to sell quickly to whoever would buy, accepting whatever offer they could get, just to escape the nightmare. She's not just on a power trip, Rachel. She's making serious money from this operation, Walter said, pulling out another folder. Then he showed me bank records he'd somehow obtained through a friend who works at the county office documents that revealed the scope of this conspiracy. Mildred receives a $50,000 consulting fee from Titan Holdings every time a property in our neighborhood gets sold to them. $50,000 per house, Rachel. That's not pocket change. That's systematic fraud. The scope of this hit me like a truck. This wasn't just HOA overreach or a power-hungry neighbor taking rules too seriously. It was organized real estate fraud using the HOA as a weapon. I actually had to stop and stare at Walter after that revelation, processing the fact that this sweet-looking woman had turned our neighborhood into her personal profit center. $50,000 per house meant she'd already made over $250,000 from destroying families' lives. The next morning brought another violation notice, this one even more ridiculous than the previous ones, for unauthorized lawn modification, because I'd trimmed the grass too short to comply with their previous violation. My perfectly measured 2.9 inches now violated some minimum height requirement that apparently existed but was never mentioned in any of the original documentation I'd received. The notice claimed I was creating an aesthetic imbalance in the neighborhood, and failing to maintain property standards consistent with community expectations. It was like being trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare where the rules changed every time you tried to follow them. I stood there staring at my lawn like a battlefield I'd already lost twice. I called Monica Albright, the real estate attorney Walter had recommended, when I told him about my situation. She's in her early 40s, sharp as a tack, with the kind of confidence that comes from fighting these battles before, and she understood exactly what was happening the moment I started explaining. "Rachel, they're building what we call a violation pipeline," Monica explained over the phone, her voice carrying the weight of experience with these tactics. "Each citation creates legal justification for more serious action, and they're designed to be impossible to fully comply with. Don't pay any fines yet. That's admitting guilt to violations that may not even be legitimate under actual HOA law." When I asked what happens if I don't pay, she said, "They'll escalate, which is exactly what we want. We need them to overplay their hands so we can expose the real pattern here and build a case that shows systematic abuse." Maybe I should have just walked away at that point, taken whatever financial loss I could manage and started over somewhere else. I don't know. But something about Monica's confidence and Walter's determination made me think we might actually have a chance to fight back against this system. I started documenting everything with the obsessive detail that comes naturally to an architect, photographing my lawn daily from multiple angles, recording timestamps and weather conditions, keeping detailed notes of every interaction and phone call. The evidence folder grew thicker each day, but so did the fines and violation notices arriving with increasing frequency and escalating severity. Each new notice referenced previous violations and added new requirements that seemed designed to be impossible to meet simultaneously. I was gathering ammunition for a war I didn't know how to fight, collecting evidence of a conspiracy I was only beginning to understand. The question that kept me awake at night was simple but terrifying. Would I figure out their game and find a way to stop it before they destroyed everything I'd worked for? Because one thing was becoming crystal clear. This wasn't going to end with me quietly paying fines and hoping they'd leave me alone. Either I pulled down their system brick by brick, or I'd watch them torch everything I'd ever built and walk away with the deed in their pocket. After ignoring 4 violation notices and watching the fines multiply like some kind of bureaucratic cancer designed to consume everything I owned, I received a mandatory appearance summons for the monthly HOA board meeting. The formal language made it crystal clear this wasn't a request or an invitation. This was a command appearance complete with warnings about additional penalties for non-compliance with board directives. That sounded more like threats from a collection agency than communication from neighbors. The Pine Valley Community Center had been transformed into something resembling a courtroom, with tables arranged to create a formal hearing setup that felt more like a tribunal than a neighborhood meeting. Mildred sat at the head table, with 4 board members I'd never seen before in my 3 months of living here. They looked like they'd been imported specifically for this meeting, outsiders brought in to provide the appearance of legitimate oversight while rubber stamping whatever Mildred wanted. About 20 residents occupied folding chairs arranged in neat rows, but none would make eye contact with me when I walked in looking down at their hands, or suddenly finding their phones fascinating. The atmosphere felt heavy with tension and fear, like everyone knew they were witnessing something wrong, but felt powerless to stop it. The projector flickered on like a courtroom horror film title slide, The Miller Case Study. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry at the absurdity of it all. This woman had turned my grass into a federal case, complete with charts and graphs showing alleged community impact metrics. "As you can see from the photographic evidence," Mildred announced with the enthusiasm of a prosecutor presenting a murder case, "Miss Miller's property has been in continuous violation of community standards for 6 weeks running, demonstrating a clear pattern of willful non-compliance with established neighborhood guidelines." The photos were masterfully deceptive, shot from low angles with specific lighting that made my grass look wild and overgrown, like I was running some kind of suburban jungle, in deliberate defiance of community standards. In reality, we're still talking about millimeters of difference measurements so small they required specialized tools to detect and wouldn't be visible to the naked eye from normal viewing distance. She'd even included comparison shots of other properties that supposedly demonstrated proper maintenance standards, though I noticed she'd carefully avoided photographing several board members' homes that had obvious violations. She'd never cited dandelions sprouting through sidewalk cracks and hedges that clearly exceeded any reasonable height limits. When I tried to stand and respond to these accusations, Mildred cut me off with practiced authority. "Miss Miller, you'll have an opportunity to address the board after we complete our presentation of the violations and their community impact assessment." She proceeded to read a list that went on for 5 full minutes, each item more ridiculous than the last. Initial grass height violation, unauthorized lawn modification, aesthetic disruption during non-approved hours, failure to respond to official notices, non-compliance with remediation requests, creation of visual discord within the community, aesthetic framework, and demonstrating a pattern of disregard for neighborhood harmony. I should have left. But that list, like a hit job written in bureaucratic poetry, held me in place. The room fell dead silent when Mildred announced the real purpose of this meeting. In light of Miss Miller's ongoing disregard for neighborhood harmony and failure to resolve outstanding penalties, this board hereby initiates foreclosure proceedings effective immediately under Article 12.7. I felt like I'd been hit by a truck, the air sucked out of my lungs as the implications crashed over me. "You can't foreclose on my house over grass violations," I managed to say, my voice cracking with disbelief and rising panic. Mildred slid a thick document across the table with the satisfaction of someone who'd been planning this moment for months. "Miss Miller, when you purchased your home, you signed the HOA Covenant Conditions and Restrictions Agreement. Article 12.7 clearly states that unpaid fines exceeding $5,000 constitute grounds for foreclosure action to protect community property values and neighborhood standards." My hands shook as I flipped through the pages of legal jargon, trying to find some escape clause or loophole that might save me. $5,000. How could the fines possibly be that high for grass that's barely different from everyone else's? Late fees compound daily at 18% interest. Miss Miller, administrative costs for each violation, legal fees for this enforcement action, emergency board meeting expenses. Your current balance is $4,800. One additional violation will trigger the foreclosure threshold, and I'm afraid your lawn is currently measuring 3.1 inches, which constitutes a new violation as of this morning's inspection. Seriously? Did she really just say that out loud? The math didn't even make sense, and the precision of her timing felt like watching a predator toy with its prey. I stumbled out of that meeting feeling like everyone in the neighborhood was staring at me, their eyes heavy with a mixture of pity and relief that it wasn't happening to them. My legs felt unsteady, and I had to stop twice on the walk to my car, just to catch my breath and process what had just happened. In the parking lot, 3 neighbors approached quietly. They looked terrified but determined, glancing around nervously, as if afraid Mildred might be watching from the windows. An elderly woman I'd seen tending her garden whispered, "Rachel, they did the same thing to us 2 years ago. We tried to fight it, spent thousands on legal fees, but eventually had to sell our house just to make it stop before they destroyed our credit and our savings." A middle-aged man who lived 2 streets over added, "Whatever you do, don't give up now. Fight back while you still can, because once you let them win, they'll just move on to the next family and do it all over again." These people were offering to stand with me against Mildred's machine, willing to risk becoming targets themselves to help me fight back. But I couldn't shake the feeling that their support, while brave and generous, might just paint bigger targets on all our backs. After seeing what Mildred was capable of after witnessing the systematic nature of her operation, I had to wonder if helping me would just give her more victims to add to her list. The question that haunted me as I drove home was whether I had the strength to fight this battle, not just for myself, but for everyone who might come after me if I failed to stop her now. And from the way she watched me that night, still expressionless, I had the sinking feeling she'd already planned her next move. 1 week after the HOA meeting, that felt more like a show trial, I was working at my drafting table, trying to focus on a client project and forget about the nightmare consuming my life when aggressive pounding rattled my front door, hard enough to shake the windows. 2 uniformed police officers stood on my porch with an arrest warrant that looked official and terrifying in the afternoon sunlight. "Rachel Miller, you're under arrest for criminal harassment and making terroristic threats against a public official," the taller officer announced in a voice that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else doing anything else. What I never threatened anyone, there has to be some mistake. But they weren't here to debate the merits of the case or listen to my protests. They read me my Miranda rights while neighbors peered through curtains and a few brave souls recorded with their phones from across the street, documenting what would become the most humiliating moment of my adult life. The cuffs bit down hard metal teeth around my wrists as my neighbors peeked through curtains like it was reality TV. I'd never felt so exposed and helpless walking across my own front lawn in restraints, while people I barely knew watched my life fall apart in real time. The ride to the county jail felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life implode while trapped in my own body, unable to wake up from what had to be some kind of nightmare. At the county jail, sitting in a holding cell that smelled like disinfectant and despair, I learned the specific details of Mildred's complaint against me. She said I harassed her through voicemails, that my tone created an atmosphere of fear, as if HOA disputes had turned into psychological warfare. According to her statement, I'd been stalking her residence in a menacing manner and making veiled threats against her personal safety and property. Every single allegation was completely fabricated, a work of fiction so detailed and convincing that even I started doubting my own memory for a moment. I'd called the HOA office exactly twice. Both conversations were brief, professional, and recorded on their official business line. I'd never even been to Mildred's house, wouldn't be able to find it without GPS, and had certainly never made any threats against anyone. But somehow she had phone logs showing dozens of calls from my number witness statements from board members who claimed to have overheard my aggressive and threatening behavior, and even photographs of my car allegedly parked on her street at various times. The car photos were actually taken when I visited Walter, who lives 2 houses down from Mildred, but the police report conveniently failed to mention that context or investigate the actual reason for my presence in the neighborhood. While I sat in that concrete box wearing an orange jumpsuit that made me feel like I'd already been convicted of something, the real purpose of my arrest became crystal clear through a conversation with the woman in the cell next to mine. Monica arrived 18 hours later to bail me out, bringing devastating news that explained the strategic timing of my arrest. "Rachel, they filed foreclosure the minute you were in a jumpsuit, timing it so you couldn't fight, couldn't call, couldn't breathe," she said, her voice tight with anger and professional outrage. "She's claiming you now owe $12,000 in accumulated fines, and that your arrest for terroristic threats proves you're a clear and present danger to the community, requiring immediate legal action to protect neighborhood safety and property values." $12,000. How is that mathematically possible for grass violations? I asked, feeling like I was drowning in numbers that didn't add up to anything resembling reality. Monica showed me the paperwork, a thick stack of official documents covered in legal terminology and calculations that would make a tax attorney dizzy. Late fees compound daily at 18% interest, legal fees for processing your enforcement case, emergency board meeting costs to address your escalating behavior, administrative fees for coordinating with law enforcement, security consultation fees to assess community risk. It's all fabricated nonsense, but it looks legitimate on paper to anyone who doesn't understand HOA law. I wish I could tell you I kept my cool and responded with dignity and composure. But come on, who wouldn't completely lose it? After discovering they'd been systematically framed, I actually started laughing in that courthouse hallway, the kind of hysterical laughter that comes when reality becomes so absurd that your brain just gives up trying to process it rationally. I realized with horrible clarity that this had all been planned from the very beginning, choreographed like a ballet of destruction with me as the unwitting star. The arrest wasn't punishment for crimes I'd committed. It was a tactical maneuver designed to keep me isolated and defenseless while Mildred filed paperwork to steal my house. While I couldn't make phone calls, couldn't contact my attorney, couldn't defend myself or gather evidence she was in court, presenting herself as a victim who needed legal protection from a dangerous homeowner. Sitting on that concrete bench in county jail, wearing clothes that smelled like industrial disinfectant and the fear of dozens of women who'd been there before me, I hit absolute rock bottom in a way I'd never experienced. I'm an architect. I design beautiful spaces where families create memories, build dreams into reality with blueprints and vision and careful planning. Now I was facing the loss of my own home, the destruction of everything I'd worked toward, because of 0.2 inches of grass and a woman who'd turned neighborhood politics into organized crime. For the first time since this nightmare began, I genuinely doubted myself and wondered if I was strong enough to keep fighting. Maybe I should have just paid that first $200 fine and accepted that some battles aren't worth fighting. Maybe I should have kept my head down, played their corrupt game, stayed invisible, and avoided drawing attention to myself. The doubt ate at me worse than the embarrassment or fear, whispering that I'd brought this destruction on myself, by refusing to be a victim quietly. What would you do in that situation? Give up everything you've worked for to end the harassment or risk losing absolutely everything in a fight you might not be strong enough to win? I had exactly 30 days before the foreclosure hearing that would determine whether I kept my home or lost everything to Mildred's systematically orchestrated fraud. 30 days to save the house I'd designed with my own hands, saved for, through years of careful budgeting, dreamed about during countless nights of planning and hoping. Standing in my driveway at sunset, still wearing the clothes I'd slept in at county jail, smelling like institutional soap and defeat, I faced the biggest decision of my life. The rational move would be to walk away. But if I did, what would happen to the next family who got a notice for a 2-inch weed? Either way, my life as I'd known it was over. The only question was whether it would end in surrender or in a fight that might at least warn the next family about what they were really up against. With Monica's guidance and Walter's moral support, I transformed my dining room into a war room that would have impressed any military strategist. As an architect, I'm trained to manage complex projects with multiple variables, tight deadlines, and intricate details that all have to work together perfectly. And this legal case became my most important design challenge. I created detailed site surveys of every property in Pine Valley, photographing and measuring lawns, fences, landscaping features, and maintenance conditions with the systematic precision of a professional inspection. My database revealed dozens of violations identical to mine that had never been cited, including properties owned by HOA board members themselves who apparently lived by different rules than the rest of us. Using my professional drafting software, I created scaled technical drawings showing the exact measurements of my grass on every date Mildred had photographed it, with elevation markers, weather conditions, and photographic angles that proved her evidence had been deliberately manipulated to make normal lawn maintenance look like criminal negligence. I charted every blade of grass like it was a criminal alibi, graphs, elevations, timestamps, proof that their claims were cosmetic lies in legal costume. I wasn't sure if all this documentation would matter in a legal system that seemed designed to favor whoever had the most official-looking paperwork, but it felt good to finally be doing something productive instead of just reacting to their endless stream of attacks and accusations. Walter helped me contact families who'd been forced out of the neighborhood through Mildred's systematic harassment campaigns, and their stories were heartbreaking but remarkably consistent in their details. Each family told the same ghost story: petty infractions, twisted fines, paranoia, and finally the for sale sign like a gravestone on the front lawn. One family told me how Mildred had their children afraid to play in their own yard because she would take pictures through their fence and claim they were disturbing community peace with excessive noise and activity. Another elderly couple described how she'd cited them for unauthorized garden modifications when they planted tomatoes in their backyard, claiming vegetable gardens violated aesthetic standards that were never mentioned in any official HOA documentation. While researching Titan Holdings LLC through public records and corporate filings, spending hours in the county clerk's office with boxes of documents that most people never bother to examine, I discovered something that made my hands shake with excitement and terror. The company's business address was just a P.O. box in a strip mall, the phone number connected to a generic answering service that couldn't provide any information about actual employees or operations. But buried in the original business license application filed 7 years ago was an emergency contact name that changed everything Mildred Finch. That can't be right, I thought, staring at the document in disbelief. But when I dug deeper through corporate filings, Secretary of State records, and business registration databases, I found the smoking gun that revealed the true scope of her criminal enterprise. Mildred wasn't just collecting consulting fees, she owned the puppet show and the puppets. Titan Holdings was her mask. The neighborhood was her stage. She'd been using her HOA position to identify homeowners to target systematically harassing them with manufactured violations and escalating fines, then purchasing their properties at drastically below market prices through her shell company when they became desperate to escape the harassment. This wasn't just abuse of HOA authority or a power-hungry neighbor taking community rules too seriously. It was systematic real estate fraud on a scale that affected multiple families and probably violated numerous federal laws. Monica, I found it. I called my attorney, barely able to contain my excitement and speak clearly into the phone. She's been running an elaborate real estate investment scam, using the HOA as her weapon to force people out and steal their houses. Rachel, this changes everything about our legal strategy, Monica said, her voice sharpening, with the focus of a prosecutor who just found the key evidence in a major case. We're not just fighting a foreclosure anymore. We're exposing a criminal conspiracy that's been operating for years, and we have documentation that could bring down her entire operation. I stayed up all night organizing evidence, creating charts that showed the pattern of violations, forced A's and financial transfers, connecting dots that revealed a sophisticated criminal enterprise disguised as community management. Every piece of documentation told the same story. Mildred Finch had been systematically defrauding homeowners in our community, using her position of trust to identify targets and manipulate the legal system to steal their most valuable assets. Looking back, I should have realized how dangerous this made me to her operation, how desperate she'd become to silence me before I could expose everything. But at the time, I was just excited to finally understand what we were really fighting, and to have evidence that might actually stop her from destroying more families. The foreclosure hearing was scheduled for exactly 2 weeks from that day, giving us barely enough time to organize a complex legal case that would expose years of systematic fraud. I had enough evidence to destroy Mildred's entire criminal operation, but I needed more time to organize everything for court presentation and locate additional witnesses who could testify about her pattern of abuse. Every day brought new discoveries as Walter and I contacted more families, uncovered more fraudulent transactions, and documented more violations of both HOA law and basic ethical standards. The evidence was overwhelming, but presenting it effectively in court would require the kind of legal strategy that could make or break everything I'd worked toward. I was holding the key to destroying Mildred's empire and possibly saving other families from the same systematic abuse I'd endured. But walking into that courtroom would be like declaring war on someone who had already proven she was willing to have me arrested on fabricated charges to protect her criminal enterprise. Would the court believe a woman with lawn diagrams and fraud spreadsheets, or would they keep siding with the HOA president whose smile sold lies better than I sold truth? Word spread quickly through Pine Valley about my discoveries, carried in whispered conversations, at mailboxes and hushed phone calls between neighbors who'd been too terrified to speak up before, but were finding courage in numbers. People who'd been isolated by fear and intimidation started reaching out in secret, sharing stories that revealed the true scope of Mildred's reign of terror. Sometimes just a text, sometimes whispered confessions at mailboxes, but each one was a brick in the foundation of something I hadn't felt in months: hope. A veteran neighbor whose wife had suffered a nervous breakdown from constant HOA harassment volunteered to testify about the psychological warfare tactics Mildred used to break families' spirits before forcing them out. Another family drove 3 hours from their new town, risking Mildred's retaliation to help build our case with documentation they'd saved from their own nightmare experience. We held clandestine meetings in Walter's garage after dark, checking for surveillance and speaking in low voices, like resistance fighters planning to overthrow a dictator. Each family contributed crucial pieces of the puzzle: photographs of their own manufactured violations, recorded phone calls with HOA board members, documentation of the systematic abuse that had driven them from their homes. The pattern was so consistent, it read like a training manual for organized harassment, with each case following identical escalation timelines and using the same manipulative tactics to destroy families' financial stability and emotional well-being. One evening, a woman I'd only seen in passing dropped a revelation that expanded the scope of Mildred's crimes far beyond what we'd already uncovered. "Rachel, we never actually sold to Titan Holdings like the other families," she said, spreading closing documents across Walter's workbench. "Our buyer was something called Pine Valley Development Corporation, but look at this signature on the notary documents." She pointed to a signature that belonged to Mildred's personal attorney, the same man who was representing the HOA in my foreclosure case, and had been present at the kangaroo court meeting where they'd voted to steal my house. Pine Valley Development Titan Holdings, Sunset Properties LLC, they're all shell companies, Monica realized as she reviewed the paperwork under Walter's garage light, each with matching P.O. boxes, identical contract templates, and one recurring name buried 3 layers deep. Mildred has been creating multiple fake corporations to hide the money trail and avoid detection by banking regulators or law enforcement agencies that might notice the same company buying distressed properties repeatedly. We now had evidence of dozens of fraudulent property transfers, forged documents, and a conspiracy involving fake companies that spanned multiple counties and possibly multiple states. The sophistication of the operation was staggering. This wasn't some amateur scam run by a bored retiree, but a professional criminal enterprise that had been operating undetected for years. Walter brought out his secret weapon one evening, producing a shoebox filled with small recording devices that looked like something from a spy movie. "For 5 years I've been secretly recording board meetings," he admitted with a sheepish grin that didn't hide the determination in his eyes. Mildred never suspected the harmless old guy sitting in the corner, taking notes and asking simple questions. But listen to this recording from 2 years ago, before you even knew Pine Valley existed. He played an audio file that sent chills down my spine. Mildred's voice came through crystal clear, speaking with the casual confidence of someone who believed she was among trusted conspirators. "The Miller property will be perfect for Phase 3 expansion once we acquire it. Corner lot, excellent square footage, prime location for maximum resale value. We just need to identify the right pressure points to motivate her departure efficiently." It wasn't just a plan, it was a business pitch made in the voice of someone who thought humanity was an optional expense. Her attorney's voice responded with professional detachment. "What about manufactured landscape violations? We've had tremendous success with grass height enforcement in previous cases. The documentation looks legitimate to outside observers, and most homeowners pay the fines rather than challenge them legally." Mildred's laugh was genuinely chilling. "Excellent strategy. Begin building the violation file immediately and make sure we have photographic evidence that supports escalated enforcement actions." They'd planned my harassment and systematic destruction 2 full years before I even bought the house, identifying me as a target based on my property's value and location rather than any actual violations of community standards. 3 days before the foreclosure hearing, that would determine whether I kept my home or lost everything to systematic fraud, I got a phone call that changed the entire scope of our fight. A reporter from the local news station had heard about our case through social media posts that neighbors had been sharing, and she'd been investigating HOA abuse throughout California for 6 months as part of a larger story about housing fraud. "Miss Miller, we've been tracking similar cases across multiple counties, and your situation could be the centerpiece of a major expose that helps thousands of homeowners who are suffering in silence." She explained, her voice carrying the excitement of a journalist who had found the story that could make her career. "Would you be willing to go on camera and share your documentation? We have resources to verify your evidence and connections that could bring state regulators into this investigation." I thought about all the families who'd been too scared to fight back, who'd lost their homes and stayed silent to protect themselves from further retaliation. I thought about the families who might be targeted next if Mildred's operation continued unchallenged, and the children who'd grow up displaced because their parents couldn't afford to fight systematic fraud. "Yes, absolutely," I told her without hesitation. "It's time people understand what's really happening in communities like ours and how these systems prey on ordinary families who just want to live peacefully in their own homes. Have you ever had to choose between your personal safety and doing what's right for other people who can't protect themselves?" Because that's what this felt like. Stepping into the spotlight, knowing it would make me a bigger target, but understanding that silence would just enable more victims. The night before court, I stood in my living room, surrounded by evidence boxes, legal documents, recorded testimonies, and the moral support of neighbors who'd finally found their courage to speak up against a system that had terrorized them for years. Tomorrow, we weren't just fighting for my house. We were exposing a criminal enterprise that preyed on ordinary people trying to live with dignity in their own communities. The evidence was overwhelming, the legal strategy was solid, and we had media coverage that would ensure Mildred couldn't make this disappear quietly, even if she managed to win in court. But I also knew that walking into that courtroom meant declaring total war on someone who had already proven she was willing to have me arrested on fabricated charges and wouldn't hesitate to escalate her attacks if she felt cornered. I had everything I needed to destroy Mildred's criminal empire and possibly save dozens of other families from the same systematic abuse. But walking into that courtroom felt like stepping off a cliff with no guarantee there would be solid ground waiting below, knowing that failure would mean losing everything, while success might just paint an even bigger target on my back for whatever revenge she might plan next. This wasn't paranoia anymore, it was preparation. And this war was no longer just for my house. The foreclosure hearing took place in a packed Superior Court courtroom that buzzed with tension and anticipation, filled with neighbors, reporters, and curious onlookers who'd heard about our case through word of mouth and social media coverage. Judge Eleanor Vance, known throughout the county for her sharp legal mind and absolute zero tolerance for fraud or abuse of the legal system, presided over what looked more like a community uprising than a routine real estate proceeding. Her reputation for cutting through legal nonsense and holding lawyers accountable had earned her respect from honest attorneys and fear from those who relied on technicalities and manipulation to win cases. Mildred sat at the plaintiff's table with her attorney, both dressed in expensive suits and projecting the kind of confidence that comes from years of getting away with systematic fraud. She had no idea that her entire criminal operation was about to be exposed on live television, or that we'd spent weeks building a case that would destroy not just her foreclosure attempt, but her entire real estate scam. The atmosphere in the courtroom felt electric with anticipation, like everyone sensed they were about to witness something significant that would be talked about for years. When her attorney stood to present their case, he displayed the same arrogance and condescension that had characterized every interaction I'd had with their side, clearly expecting this to be another routine victory in their pattern of systematic abuse. Your Honor, Miss Miller has been in flagrant violation of legally binding HOA regulations for over 4 months, accumulating $12,000 in legitimate fines while demonstrating increasingly aggressive behavior toward board members, he announced with practiced authority, displaying the same fabricated evidence that had been building for months. She currently owes $12,000 in legitimate fines and has demonstrated a clear pattern of escalating aggression that culminated in criminal harassment charges, requiring police intervention to protect community safety. He presented Mildred's carefully constructed narrative with slides and charts that made my normal lawn maintenance look like criminal vandalism, using misleading photographs and inflated financial calculations to justify stealing my house. The presentation was polished and professional, designed to make their systematic fraud look like legitimate community enforcement, and I had to admit it was convincing if you didn't know the real story behind every document and photograph. When Monica stood to present our defense, the entire energy in the courtroom shifted from routine legal proceeding to something much more significant and dramatic. Your Honor, this is not a legitimate foreclosure case involving HOA violations, she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent weeks preparing for this moment. What we have here is the culmination of an elaborate criminal conspiracy that has systematically defrauded multiple families in the Pine Valley community and possibly throughout California. We presented our evidence like architects constructing a building, methodically, precisely, with every piece supporting the overall structure of our case and building toward an inescapable conclusion. First, my scaled architectural drawings displayed on large screens throughout the courtroom, proving mathematically that my grass was never significantly outside acceptable parameters and that the alleged violations were manufactured using deceptive photography and selective enforcement. Second, photographic surveys of the entire neighborhood, showing dozens of identical violations on other properties that were never cited, including homes owned by HOA board members who apparently lived by different rules than the families they targeted for harassment. Third, public records and corporate filings revealing Mildred's secret ownership of Titan Holdings and multiple shell companies used to purchase foreclosed properties at below market prices from families she'd systematically harassed into financial desperation. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, presented with professional precision that left no room for alternative explanations or legal technicalities. Your Honor, I'd like to play audio evidence that proves this conspiracy was premeditated and systematic, I announced, standing to address the court directly for the first time in my life. Walter's secret recording filled the silent courtroom, with Mildred's own voice discussing manufactured violations and pressure tactics to force me out of my house. Recorded 2 full years before I even knew Pine Valley existed, proving that I'd been targeted for property acquisition rather than any legitimate community standards enforcement. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs and gasps as the implications of that recording hit everyone simultaneously. Judge Vance pounded her gavel for order, but her expression had shifted from judicial neutrality to barely controlled outrage as she processed the evidence of systematic fraud being perpetrated under the guise of legitimate community management. Mildred's face drained of all color as she realized her own words were destroying the carefully constructed facade she'd maintained for years, while her attorney frantically shuffled papers in a desperate attempt at damage control that everyone could see was futile. Furthermore, Your Honor, Monica continued once the courtroom quieted, we have testimony from 12 victim families and documentation proving this fraud extends far beyond our community to similar schemes throughout California. The news reporter stood in the gallery with the court's permission and submitted additional evidence her investigation had uncovered. Your Honor, our investigation has revealed evidence of similar schemes in 3 other California counties, all involving HOA board members connected to real estate investment fraud using identical tactics and shell company structures. We estimate the total scope of this conspiracy at over $2 million in fraudulent property transfers affecting dozens of families who lost their homes to systematic harassment and manufactured violations. The folder of additional evidence she submitted was thick enough to represent months of investigative work, connecting Mildred's operation to a broader network of real estate fraud that spanned multiple jurisdictions and involved numerous criminal conspirators. Judge Vance reviewed the evidence with visible anger, the silence broken only by Mildred's labored breathing and the rustle of documents that would decide the fate of everything I'd built. After what felt like hours, but was only minutes, she delivered her ruling with a tone that left no room for appeal. This court finds no grounds for foreclosure action against Miss Miller. All fines assessed are dismissed as fraudulently obtained through systematic abuse of HOA authority and violation of homeowner rights protected under California law. She turned her focus to Mildred with the intensity of someone who had spent years fighting corruption. Miss Finch, you are removed from all HOA board positions effective immediately. I'm ordering a criminal investigation into your activities with full cooperation from the State Attorney General's office. All assets obtained through fraud are subject to immediate seizure, and I'm recommending federal charges due to the interstate nature of this conspiracy. Mildred collapsed in her chair as her carefully constructed empire crumbled around her in real time, while her attorney was already packing his briefcase and clearly planning his exit strategy from what had become a career-ending disaster. I wish I could tell you, I felt triumphant in that moment, but honestly I just felt exhausted and overwhelmed with relief that someone in authority had finally seen through her fraud. As court adjourned, something beautiful and unexpected happened that restored my faith in community and human decency. One by one, neighbors approached not just the allies who had helped build our case, but people who'd been too frightened to speak up, before including families I'd never met who'd been suffering in silence under Mildred's systematic abuse. An elderly woman with tears streaming down her face took my hands and said, "Rachel, you gave us back our voices and our dignity. We'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up for ourselves until you showed us it was possible." The veteran neighbor shook my hand with military precision and said, "You fought the battle. I was too broken to fight myself. Thank you for proving that ordinary people can still win against systems designed to crush them." Even strangers approached with their own HOA horror stories from other neighborhoods, asking for advice and looking for hope that change was possible in their own communities. 3 months later, the criminal justice system delivered the final chapter of Mildred's story. She pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges, fraud, conspiracy, abuse of authority, and racketeering, receiving a 3-year prison sentence and ordered to pay $1.2 million in restitution. Titan Holdings and its network of shell companies were dissolved by court order, with all fraudulently obtained assets returned to the families she had systematically robbed. The ripple effects of our victory extended far beyond Pine Valley, creating changes that helped thousands of families across California who'd been suffering under similar systematic abuse. The local news investigation sparked statewide legislative action, with California passing new laws requiring greater oversight of HOA boards, limiting their foreclosure powers, and establishing clear appeals processes for homeowners facing harassment or manufactured violations. The Pine Valley HOA underwent complete reorganization with new leadership committed to transparency, reasonable community standards, and the radical concept that neighbors should help each other rather than look for reasons to cause problems. Walter became our new president with a simple governing philosophy that transformed our community. Neighbors helping neighbors, not controlling them. My story became a catalyst for change that resonated with people throughout the country who were dealing with similar abuse, proving that ordinary individuals can fight back against systematic corruption when they have courage, evidence, and community support. 8 months after my arrest for grass that was 0.2 inches too long, I'm sitting in my backyard watching it grow freely at exactly 3.6 inches, and it's beautiful. No rulers, no fines, no HOA drones with cameras. Just grass, just peace. Funny how a patch of lawn nearly cost me everything, but in the end it gave me something bigger clarity. Turns out the real weeds weren't in my yard. They were in the boardroom, hiding behind bylaws and polite smiles, betting I'd stay quiet. But not this time. Maybe the real lesson is that dignity doesn't come from following rules that were never meant to protect you. It comes from pushing back even when your voice shakes. If you're still here, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Ever had to stand your ground against an HOA or a system stacked against you? And hey, if you want to support the channel, that little thanks button down below goes a long way. Thanks for hanging out. Catch you in the next one.
QA Stories signing off for now, but the drama, it never sleeps. Tap that bell if you're ready for round 2.